Welcome to From Clinical to Entrepreneurial, OT Private Practice Journeys, an Ontario Society of Occupational Therapists podcast. In this series, we connect with occupational therapists, private practitioners, and business owners, and we hear about their inspiration, their stories, and their lessons learned. I'm Seema Santwani, OSOT's Director of Strategic Partnerships and Practice. In this episode, my co-host Shari and I interview Tricia Morrison, an OT with over 30 years of experience. She's worked in private practice in different forms over her career in the Ottawa region. Tricia's experience offers a unique long-term perspective on the evolution of private practice, from its early handshake deals to today's complex business structures. Regardless of where you are in your private practice journey, this episode is packed with wisdom, practical advice, and a refreshing take on business collaboration. Hello, Tricia, and welcome to the podcast. It is great to have you with us.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Great. So we're going to launch right in. Tell us a little bit about how you got started in the profession of occupational therapy.
So how I got started in the profession of occupational therapy is that I was drawn to healthcare and helping people. And ultimately, I kind of say the word, of course, I was initially thinking about physiotherapy because I think that happens to a lot of people. But when I went to, as a high school student, went to observe a physiotherapist, I was really very interested with what the other lady was doing.
Oh, interesting.
So it really was organic growth of kind of understanding and learning more about the difference between OT and PT and kind of exploring that a little bit further. So yeah, that's how it happened.
And you went to McGill, right, for your undergrad?
That's where I went. And
so for background, sorry, for our listeners, for background, Tricia and I have known each other for a very, very long time. So I will possibly be jumping the gun on a few of her answers here.
So yes, I think it's kind of uncanny because I am an Anglophone. So the University of Ottawa course did exist back in 1989 when I left Ottawa, but I had to leave Ottawa in order to go to Montreal in order to study in English instead of staying in Ottawa because it was a Francophone program. But that was, that was just the way of it. And it was a wonderful experience.
But you've gone on now because now you are a Dr. Tricia Morrison.
Yes, I did. So after I practiced for a few years and felt the need to kind of return to ongoing education, and I've done a few different things. So I did a master's in education, and then I continued on in order to get my doctorate. I did a postdoc at the School of Rehab here in Ottawa. So the master's and the postgraduate work has all happened at the University of Ottawa, and the other postgraduate certificate I have is in life care planning.
So I know because so for the listeners' information, I was working for Tricia. I started working for Tricia in I think 2003, maybe 2004. But anyway, so she was growing her own private practice at the time and doing her master's in education and then went on to get her PhD. But how did you get into private practice in the first place? Because when you first graduated with your bachelor's,
so, I mean, I had a dream. I knew exactly what job I wanted to work at. I wanted to work in brain injury rehab. I knew the exact facility, the exact department, the exact team of OTs that I wanted to work with. And of course, when I graduated, that job wasn't available to me. So, and I guess the other thing is I was still thinking that I wanted a full-time job. I really wasn't contemplating looking for 2 part-time jobs, which in retrospect, that might have been a different journey to have taken. But I kind of went down the street to where I knew that there was another OT that I had met in this previous facility who was working in private rehab. And so I went and I met with her and she said, oh, by the way, we're hiring. Would you like to meet the bosses? So it was quite organic in the nature of just asking questions and learning a little bit more. And so I fell into private practice OT working for someone else back when I first graduated and first was available back in 1993 and 1994.
And then how did that move you to starting your own practice? Because for the listeners' interest, as we're progressing through this, Tricia has done it all. Tricia has worked for other people. She's built a business with employees. She's worked independently. She's worked for a big corporation, and she teaches private practice at the University of Ottawa. So we have a lot of information to gather from you today.
So I ended up working for that private rehab company, and that private rehab company was owned and operated by people who had, I mean, they were wonderful people. They had a different sort of a different viewpoint, I would say, in how they were approaching rehab. And when things changed in legislation, things became financially quite difficult. And so there was decisions being made that I wasn't entirely comfortable with. And so therefore I made a decision 3.5 years after working for the other, for this company, to kind of, hang out my own shingle. And I have a
Tricia, were those, Tricia, I'm going to stop you for a second, just for our listeners. Were those business decisions that you weren't comfortable with? Was it more sort of the values or the rehab focus? I just think it's an important question, because we've heard from folks around, I left somewhere because my values didn't align, so just tell us a little bit about the overall arching type of decisions.
So for me, the challenge at that point in time, when there was fiscal restraint needing to occur within the practice, for me, I became uncomfortable with the decisions being based upon money.
Right.
And so I strongly believe that I just wanted to focus on doing OT well, and doing it in the way that I thought it ethically needed to be done. Not to say it wasn't being done ethically. It was just, there was some movement, some, I'm going to say pressure, for the lack of a better word, to deliver financially. And that's the part that I was less comfortable with. And so that's where I hung up my own shingle after 3.5 years.
So I have 2 questions for you, and I wrote them both down so I won't forget. The first one is about the legislation changes, because just for the people listening, they might not necessarily be aware of how sort of legislation changes impact things. And here I think you're talking more about like the auto industry as well, right? Where there are periodic reviews and changes that impact how we practice. I wonder if you could just speak to that. If someone's planning to get into the insurer industry, what do they need to be aware of, and how do they get that information?
So, okay, so that's a big...
It's coming up again, I know. Sorry.
So in Ontario, in each province, there's different rules governing auto insurance. So every time there's a new provincial, there's a new political party that comes into power in the province, they take a look at the auto legislation. And I think it's probably because it's a very large, a very expensive / lucrative area of business in the province. And there's a lot of push and pull that kind of happens between the different entities who have interests associated with it. So I think there's a lot of inclination in the political parties to take a look at it. And it, colloquially, I will say that it seems like each party that comes in kind of wants to put their fingerprints on the legislation. And so when I first started working in auto sector back in early 1994, it was an NDP government that was in power. And so at that point in time, the benefits were quite, I'm going to say, lucrative. They were plentiful. And so what has happened over time is that I think there's been a realization that being able to sustain that level of benefit was not possible. So therefore, the subsequent successions of political power have kind of revised and shaped the legislation. And with each revision and reshaping, there was different kind of foci, I think is the plural of focus. There was different foci that happened in the legislation, and it impacted how we delivered the professionals that were funded, the services that were able to be covered under the statutory accident benefits.
So it might be that years ago, someone with a certain level of injury, non-catastrophic versus catastrophic, non-catastrophic had a much bigger funding pool or pot of rehabilitation dollars that they could access, provided it was approved and so on, but they could have a much longer unrestricted string of rehabilitation than now. And now the rehabilitation options are much smaller. So that's really, and like Tricia was saying, each one of these legislation changes results in some pretty big pivots for the companies that are doing it, because you kind of have to change your processes and your expectations, because when you think that you've got, unlimited funding versus now your client has X number of dollars. And in some ways, I think the restriction stimulates more creativity and so on the therapist's part, because you've got fewer dollars with which to work with. But I mean, it does cause a lot of issues from a business perspective too, and from a therapeutic support perspective, because you're always trying to figure out how best to help the client in the different scenarios. Jumping back to you starting your business though, Tricia. So I'm assuming because you had been doing this work, you were connected with different adjusters, you had a network to get started. How did that process go? Did you have sort of non-solicitation agreement at that time with the company you were working with? What did you do?
There was no non-solicitation agreement at that time. So
okay.
I did have that. I'm going to say that benefit is that I could quickly segue from working for them to having my own sort of shingle. And really all I did at that point in time was let them know how they could contact me. It would be a different beast today based upon solicitation agreements, which is, I always make a point of reviewing those with the students that are in my classes at the University of Ottawa, because I think it is vitally important that we understand why non-solicitation agreements exist and how to make your decisions wisely as it relates to what you're signing, and respecting the essence of those agreements.
Could you give the 5-second explainer of what a non-solicitation agreement is for listeners who might not know?
So the actual agreement will vary from they vary. So the stipulations will vary. So an example might be that when you leave a specific practice, you are not going to contact the customers of that practice in order to solicit or pull the business into a new practice. The other thing is that you shall not be soliciting the employees from that other practice. So it's not like someone can start a new practice and then go back to their previous employer and pull over their favorite coworkers in order to be able to set up a new practice. And really, I mean, the essence of a non-solicitation is to protect the people who are taking the risk and setting up their own thing and investing in the education and development of especially younger OTs, right? And so I think we all want that protection, and we want to protect that protection. The benefit to the employees who are signing it is that they should be getting a commitment from their employer that, okay, with this knowledge that we have this agreement and this trust that's building between us, I'm now invested in helping in your development and your learning, rather than it feeling like there's any secrets or that the employer is kind of holding back at all. So, there's pros and cons, but it's really making sure that the essence of it. I always encourage the students that they take a non-solicitation agreement when it's presented to them and take it to somebody who is more knowledgeable than them. So whether that be a parent or someone else in their family who is knowledgeable about these things or experienced in business, or even a lawyer, go meet with somebody who can explain these different clauses, give you examples as to how they pertain to you in the future, so that you really do understand what you're signing, the pros and the cons.
And then speaking of lawyers, so when you started, did you consult with a lawyer? Did you consult with an accountant? How did you go about getting things set up for your independent practice?
So my main two, absolutely, is that the first one was my accountant, is that I went and I met with my accountant, and he really helped me confirm in my mind the steps that I needed to go through, aspects of the government that I needed to register with, etc. Then the second person was a lawyer down the road in order to make sure that everything was set up properly. And of course, my list of key advisors has grown over the years. Certainly my accountant is always, top of the list. The lawyer is there kind of more so for annual type requirements, but another key person as a key subject matter expert is ITs. Like having somebody to set up the computers and make sure that all of the requirements for security and privacy, et cetera, that's all taken care of.
That's a good point, and I'm jumping ahead because I know what you're doing right now. So I know that you're not working in a clinic management software because of the nature of your job. You don't need one.
Exactly.
So, see, now there's 7 questions that I want to ask all at once, but I'm going to go back in time. We're going to take this time by time, and I'm going to make a note here about IT now, because I think other independent providers might be really curious to know about what you're doing for security and so on right now. However, backing up, so you started your own practice, things are going well, you started to grow accidentally, as is a theme. Can you tell us about that, please?
Yeah, I like to tell this story because I think there's something for us all to learn from it, is that I got a phone call from Jennifer, and Jennifer was a relatively new grad, and I didn't know Jennifer, but somehow she had heard of me, and she called me on 3 different occasions, and each occasion it was, I'd just like to take you for coffee. That was her question, right? And so the first few times I just felt too busy, and I was really quite focused on having a practice that was just what I consider me, myself, and I. Like I didn't want anything grand and glorious. But eventually I had a baby, and that baby was now taking up some time and energy that I used to apply to my practice, and realizing I could no longer do everything I used to do. And so I met with Jennifer and we had coffee, and she was, cute and spunky and smart and presented well and eager, and like all those positive adjectives that you would want to have as part of your team. So I decided, I took the leap, and the leap was to hire my first employee. So again, back to the drawing board of going back to the key consultants, right? Going back to the accountant to make sure payroll is set up, going back to the lawyer to get the employment agreement, talk about non-solicitation agreements, all of that stuff comes into having those relationships with those established key people, those key consultants. So Jennifer came on board, and not only did Jennifer pick up what I'll call the slack of what I was unable to do, but as I said, all those positive adjectives, Jennifer was energetic and dynamic and smart and hardworking, and she started to create her own work, right? Like referrals started to come in for Jennifer. And so before we knew it, we had too much work for the 2 of us. So then you hire the 3rd person. And if you're hiring well, the benefit is it snowballs.
Yeah.
So it was definitely an organic growth that happened, just based upon the great quality of people who were part of our team.
And they were employees, correct, Tricia? You're the business owner. They were not independent contractors. They're your employees.
Yes, I ran with an employee model for sure.
Okay.
Hourly versus salary, yeah?
It was hourly, yeah.
May I ask two questions? One
I do want
is-
to come back to that though, hourly versus salary, because I think there's pros and cons.
I would also like to hear about that because we have, yes, we have all forms within our own practice as well, and we're always looking at different models. So the first one is when you decided to bring Jennifer on, what was your math? And here I'm talking like, how did you break it down? Who did you talk to? What was your formula to figure out how much you could afford to pay her?
Now that's a long time ago, so I don't necessarily remember who I spoke to, but it would have been other OTs.
So you looked at what the going rate was for other OTs.
Yeah, yeah. What are other people paying their OTs? What are other OTs making who are working for private enterprise? I would have also gone to my accountant in order to say, okay, this is how much we're charging hourly. This is, this is like just to, because as a new, I mean, let's face it, we go to OT school to become OTs.
Yeah.
We don't come out with an abundance of business knowledge.
No,
and
we
so
don't.
that's where I very much feel that having those key consultants, as I'll say, on speed dial, to be able to go to and say, okay, a new predicament, new situation, I need to talk about this. And whether they're educating you or they're actually functioning as your sounding board, it's making sure that you have those people in your life to be able to have those topical conversations.
Yeah. So what you essentially did is you said, okay, this is my hourly, this is the hourly rate the practice receives. This is the going rate for occupational therapists of, comparable experience and so on. These are my operating costs. Okay, accountant, are my profit margins okay? Is this going to work?
That's exactly right.
Perfect. Okay, and then the next one is, how did you find employees?
Ooh, you are going back quite a ways. So I definitely, like, as I said, Jennifer found me.
Yeah.
And then after that, I do believe that we were using OSOT and CAOT's career postings.
And I know how you found one employee, and this is different from what most other people have been talking about, because I know you hired one employee by hiring a recruiter, and the recruiter did the work of finding the employee. And I know that because it was me.
There you go.
That's interesting.
And I think I used that. I used a recruiter on a couple of occasions, and it's predominantly because like the career postings are great, but I think that sometimes when there's 10 career posts and they're all for the same sort of entity or practice, how is somebody who's outside that area of practice really to know how to choose one over the other? Because let's face it, most of the offerings are quite similar.
Yeah, it's hard to tell the difference from one practice to the next. It really is, especially if you don't know. Okay, so you did want to talk a little bit more about hourly and salary for employees. We'd love to hear more about your thoughts on that.
So my take on hourly versus salary was that I came from a previous employer where I was paid a salary, and there was an expectation that we work a certain number of hours per week.
Yeah.
For some people, that created an undue level of stress. That requirement to have to bill, not just work, right? Because as a younger or a newer employee, or even if you're an experienced OT coming into a new sector, it takes a while to sort of come up to speed. And so when there's an expectation that you're going to bill 37 and a half hours a week, that can induce a stressful reaction.
Yeah,
for sure.
Based upon that experience, I therefore opted to go for an hourly wage form of remuneration, with the idea that an individual could tell me approximately how many hours a week they wanted to work.
Yeah.
And so there were some employees who were much more comfortable working, let's say 25 or 30 hours a week. And there were some that wanted to work 55 hours a week.
Right.
So it really was, and of course I knew that was overtime and we dealt with all that. But the point being that each individual was then able to determine what they wanted to do and functionally what they could reasonably do on a week-to-week basis based upon their lives.
Right.
Yeah. And how did you maintain, and I'm going to move on to the next stage because I know we've got so much to talk about, but this is the quick question. How did you maintain sort of team cohesiveness, continuing education and so on? Because this was a fully community-based practice where everybody practiced outside their homes. I remember when I started working for Tricia, she gave me a fax machine.
We are going back a ways
We're
now,
dating
aren't we?
ourselves a little bit. For our listeners, a fax machine is.
Yeah, that's right. We'll have an explanation of what that is at the bottom.
But you know, we laugh. I still have a fax machine in my office.
You would, right?
That is because the physicians will
It's
only
the
correspond with
doctors.
me.
Fax, yeah.
It's the
Yep.
physicians that are driving the maintenance of a fax
Tech.
machine.
It's
Everyone
true.
else has moved on, but not the physician.
That's funny.
Your question again?
Maintaining that team atmosphere, education, cohesiveness when everyone's spread out.
So so the education really came from trying to set annual goals with OTs, and not just annual. You know, like if something came up in the middle of the year, then we pivoted and we just went with things. But it was trying to determine what made every OT's heart sing, and trying to encourage a path of development or education that they wanted to pursue. And I'm stressing the A because I find that younger OTs are kind of like going to an apple orchard and they want this and they want this and they want this and they want this. So it's that whole idea of, okay, you can get all of it, but we have to sort of prioritize or choose a path to start with, so that you can learn and you have time to integrate and to practice those skills prior to moving on to the next learning goal or the other area. So it was really setting individual goals or interests or education plans with each OT. And then also we tried to have at least monthly meetings. In addition to, I met with each therapist on a weekly basis.
Yeah.
And that was individual time, so that ideally they had time to decompress. We had an opportunity to talk about more in-depth issues, do file reviews. So there was that opportunity to sort of make sure that even though OTs were spread all throughout Eastern Ontario, or at least the Ottawa area of it, is that I got to see, as I say, the whites of their eyes in order to kind of see what was their stress level, give them a chance to talk about things that they might not necessarily have felt as comfortable to pick up the phone in the middle of the week and have those conversations. So there was kind of those two issues, and it allowed an opportunity as therapists came and went from the office to run into each other and stand in the driveway and talk for a while.
And chat, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and you did have an office then, Tricia? There was a brick and mortar office?
In my home.
In your home. Okay.
And the only clients never came to my home, just therapists.
Okay.
Yeah.
And did you also have like an onboarding process where you provided resources to new staff that you brought on, policies, procedures? Did you have a whole process outlined for new staff?
Yes.
Yeah.
I just had a binder flashback. I forgot about the binder. I could barely carry it. So
Yes.
Tricia also, and I think almost all the way through, like toward the end, before the next stage where you ended up selling your practice, I think I was actually doing a little bit of report reviewing with you as well. But until almost the end, it was predominantly Tricia who was one-on-one reviewing all of the OT reports and providing feedback. So lots of track changes, comments, guided, that kind of thing within the report. So the mentoring happened from that perspective as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So take us now to that next stage. So what led you to start considering how was that whole process? It's a big topic. This is when you were led to the decision to sell, and then sort of what happened after.
So I'm going to back up one step before that, and I'm going to tell you about the Ontario OT Alliance.
Yes, that's helpful. Yeah.
The Ontario OT Alliance was the brainchild of Carol McDonald in Toronto. And she owned and operated Fulcrum Consultants at the time, which was an OT company. And she had the benefit of working closely with her husband, who is, I'm going to say, like, she's got a definite business mind, but she's the OT, but he really brings in some additional business minds. So they realized that there was a movement among the insurance companies, remembering that in the province of Ontario, the predominant area of private practice for OTs was and still is the automobile sector.
For sure.
So there was a movement among the auto insurers to try to facilitate their referral lists, because at that point in time, they were still facilitating a lot of referrals for both rehabilitation and independent examinations. They were doing it all. So they were really, they were, I think, probably overwhelmed with like hundreds of different little OT companies all spread within the province, let alone, you know, all the different disciplines. So Carol McDonald came up with and so the insurance companies had decided that they wanted to go to like a preferred providers. They wanted to have the companies that they could hit the 1-800 number and get a psychologist, an OT, you know, a this, a that. They could get all their services kind of at 1-800. And so it was Carol McDonald who came up with the idea of the Ontario OT Alliance. So what I understand she did is that she went to the insurance companies throughout the province of Ontario and said to many people, sort of did a verbal survey in order to say, when you have a file in Ottawa, who do you call? When you have a file in Sudbury, who do you call? When you have a file in Windsor, who do you call? And she was looking for the trends or the patterns as to the repetition of referrals. And then she did her due diligence in order to investigate to see if these OT companies had a similar mindset to her own. So then she and her husband came and met with me in order to, I'll say, pitch the Ontario OT Alliance. And so what that was, again, giving full credit to Carol and her husband, was this was an association of 5 different OT companies across the province built on a handshake. There was nothing signed. There was
Interesting.
no financial incentive to it whatsoever, but basically by pulling together 5 different OT companies that were geographically distinct from each other, there was the creation of the Ontario OT Alliance that mimicked the 1-800 number that the insurance companies were looking for. And so the benefit was that there was geographical, I'll say, expertise in each of those areas and an established network of a supervisor or owner and a team of OTs who could then address the OT work. And so this was a phenomenal experience from my standpoint, especially when we look back on it and reflect on the fact that it was all built on just a handshake. And so coming back to your original question about the decision to sell, was that Carol sold Fulcrum Consultants first. And so I would, you know, kind of being a person in the bleachers, I was able to be a spectator to that whole process. And it was seeing the opportunities that were then developed for her team that really kind of enticed me to consider it more seriously. And we were facing yet another legislation change at the time. And we talked about the legislation changes before, and Shari kind of summarized it well with respect to each time a legislation change happens, there's a necessity to evaluate it, pivot, redo processes. And it can be quite exhausting, especially when when there's lots of people who depend upon you.
Yeah. And it can
so-
also hit your business, right? Because if now there are no more funds for ongoing therapeutic support,
yes,
how do you keep filling your therapist's caseloads if you know this is going to come, right?
that's right. And so when the opportunity presented itself, we were looking down the pike of another legislation change. That's when I really opted to to seriously consider it, because I felt that it was the best thing for me to do for the team of therapists that were here at the time.
Yeah. And I think there were, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say it really, and it also broadened what we were able to do.
Yeah.
Right.
But I think there were also some other factors, just sort of in terms of like stress management and emotional load. Like, what is your advice, for a therapist who's in that stage? Or how many therapists did you have at the time? 8?
There was 10 of us.
10, right?
Yeah.
So you're feeling, I know in our own conversations, you've talked about that stress of like needing to make sure everyone was taken care of and how that put a bit of an emotional toll on you as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, from the day that I opened my practice thinking I was just going to be little old me to the fact that there was 10, a dozen years had passed. And it began to weigh on me to know that each therapist and each sandwich that was on the lunch table for their kids was dependent upon me making the right decision.
Yep.
And that's where I envy people, one of whom may be on this podcast, who is smarter at me at being able to set up their businesses so that they have other people that they're leaning on.
I'm just thinking of Tricia's words, and they're kind of echo. There's a weight to what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
The way you very eloquently articulated, that person and that sandwich for that child in their life is resting to a degree on your shoulders. And I mean, that's such a tall order. And I can appreciate, I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that before. And I can appreciate the weight that that would carry and cause you to make decisions that sounds like you made.
Yeah. And those were really the most critical factors as to why I elected to go with the sale when I did.
So now you've worked for somebody else, you've done your independent practice, you've done your own company. Now you're moving into working with a big corporation.
Yeah. And that was that was a really steep learning experience.
Yeah.
It had its pros and its cons, right? Is that it allowed the OTs who were here, and I still felt we're kind of like we were still the team of OTs.
Yes.
Yeah.
It allowed us to diversify in what we were doing. And again, reinforcing and encouraging OTs to identify what made their heart sing in order to be able to pursue ongoing education, looking at how they were developing services, how they were delivering services, development of further types of areas. And so those were the good things. The cons were really that I was then back into an environment akin to the one that I left early on, where it was financially, the decisions were based upon financial results.
Yeah.
And so that I found, again, it comes back to, I'm challenged by that. I'm challenged by making decisions about what occupational therapy is delivered when ultimately it's showing somebody who's looking at the numbers what the value of the service.
Yeah.
And so that's why after I had fulfilled the contractual agreement that I had whenever I had sold, by then I had finished my doctorate and I was working on my postdoc. So then I decided after my postdoc to set up again. And so I am what I affectionately call TMOT Take Two. I now have TMOT Take Two.
TMOT stands for Tricia Morrison Occupational Therapy. That was
Take Two. Okay, alliteration. I see you like alliteration, Tricia.
So now you are working independently. You're doing a lot of life care planning.
That is predominantly I mean, that is my bread and butter. That's what I spend the most amount of my time doing now and I very much feel like what I have done over my career has really brought me to where I am today, right?
Yeah.
Is that I'm not, first of all, you can't do life care planning without some years of experience under your belt just by virtue of getting the credential.
Right.
But I also think that it is vitally important that anybody who is doing life care planning, that they have a wealth of experience to be able to rely upon in the building of the life care plans. So really,
Yeah.
you know, I think that my advice to young OTs is find a job that makes your heart sing. Do something that you love getting out of bed for in the morning, something that speaks to your values and your mission. And it's okay if that changes over time.
Yeah.
Right? Like what serves you as a young new OT out of school, it might not work for you in 5 years or 10 years down the road. Once you, or if you elect to have a family, that changes things a lot. You start making decisions around that. And then once the kids are up and they're a little bit more independent, you can kind of come back to focusing on your career and in what direction you want to go in. And just kind of allowing yourself that path to be able to make the right decision for yourself at the time, based upon not only you and your career, but also your family circumstances.
Yeah, because it absolutely changes, like life throws so many different things at you.
Yeah.
I want to ask you two really concrete questions, although I know that we're getting close to me needing to shut up. Sorry, Seema. But two really concrete questions about your practice now, Tricia, just for other people who are looking at sort of working as a sole practitioner in your own practice, right? Not speaking toward the legal structure, just what you're doing there. So one is, I know you're more heavily based on a person-to-person networking model when it comes to your marketing. Is that correct? As opposed to, for example, online marketing, that kind of thing.
I've never really termed it like that, but I guess that would be the appropriate label.
Yeah.
Certainly, yeah, it's word of mouth, really. It's
Okay.
you are as good as your last file. So what did you deliver last time? Because that's what's going to generate the next level. I have a particular circumstance that I reflect on from time to time, is that I get referrals now from both plaintiff and defense lawyers.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a plaintiff lawyer who called me a couple of years ago. And in that conversation, he said, I'm calling you because of a report you did for a defense lawyer. And in that report, you had this certain paragraph that talked about collaborating or meeting with the plaintiff's life care planner in order to be able to resolve differences of opinion. And he said, that paragraph let me know what kind of a person you are, and I want to work with you.
Oh, that's a nice compliment. Mm-hmm. But I'm not surprised, because that's always been very much your philosophy.
Ideally, when you can collaborate with others.
Here's a Tricia story. I know I'm talking too much. Here's a Tricia story. I recently wrote a report and I met with a lawyer and he was like, oh, I liked this report. This was a good report. And I said, oh, well, Tricia Morrison, she trained me how to write reports. And he goes, oh, yeah, okay.
It all makes sense. It all makes sense.
The second question is, what are you doing for IT, for security and so on, since like so many people, when you're doing more clinical work, you're working within a clinic management software and you upload everything there and it's good to go, but that's not the format you've got with the dynamic of your practice. So what are you doing? How are you keeping your stuff secure?
So number one is I have an IT consultant and I rely on him. So he knows what the college requires. He knows the security issues. So basically everything that the college requires is what is on these computers. And basically just making sure that when I'm sending reports, I'm sending them securely.
Okay.
All of that stuff really.
So you went to him and he just sort of set you up with whatever method, like, okay, you use Secure Docs for this, you use this for this, and this is your process.
That's exactly correct.
Okay.
Because frankly, I have little patience when it comes to information technology. And when
I know.
when the computer doesn't work, he's my speed dial. He is my key consultant number one, right?
Yeah.
And I like that you added, I don't know if we've quite heard it phrased that way in some of our other episodes, Tricia, but I like that you added an IT consultant as part of your team. I always call it that team,
Yeah.
right? You said your accountant, your lawyer. I think an IT consultant is an absolutely essential member of a team so that, to your point, you can focus on what you want to focus on.
Yep.
Yeah, and I agree with that because,
Yeah.
as you know, Kevin is our IT consultant, but I would be completely lost. I mean, I've learned over the years now what we need to do, but I wouldn't have had the first clue of where to start. So Kevin is
Having
the
someone
clinic
else to
manager and my
rely on.
husband. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Tricia, just so grateful for all of your time. Really neat to see almost like a full circle, right? Started as a sole proprietor, built it, sold it back as a sole proprietor. So that's really a unique story that we haven't heard about. So thank you for sharing that with us. As we're ending this episode, I love your find what makes your heart sing. I think that's a beautiful way to end. Just wanted to give you an opportunity. Is there anything else that you'd love to leave our listeners with, or another key lesson maybe that you'd like to impart on your way out?
I do have a couple. I've taken some notes here. Is that I received some sage advice probably about 15 years ago.
Okay.
And that was, when you can't find the perfect position for yourself in one spot, make it by building a quilt. So for example, I do my practice, but I also teach at the University of Ottawa, and I'm involved in research with the students that are there. So I'm able to sort of those three things. I'm able to be involved in clinical practice. I'm able to teach. I'm able to do some research that way. It was kind of building that perfect trifecta that I'll jealously say the physicians have already built in to their employment positions through the teaching hospitals. And I wasn't able to find that for an OT. I wasn't able to find that professor position that would allow me to be able to do the clinical work. So that was sage advice number one. Number two is that as a sole proprietor, it can be isolating and lonely. Yeah. So I built, the second part is that I built a network, and that network heavily involves a lot of volunteer work, sitting on boards, being involved when things are happening. So for example, I sat on the working committee that looked at the standards of practice for life care planners. I'm sitting on a different working committee now. And so it's basically making sure that you are seeking out those opportunities that provide you a network. It not only reinforces your educational needs, but it also provides you that network so that when you have a problem or a question, you readily have access to people that you can go to and you can seek the information. And the last piece. The last piece is this. I say to the students in the course that I teach at the University of Ottawa is, your competitors are not your enemies.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Your competitors should be a component of your network, and it's ideally all in how you approach them in order to build that network over time and have your competitors also be a support network for you. You support them and they support you, and you complement each other by looking at each other's strengths and weaknesses and interests. And so rather than this was definitely an error that I did in my younger years, was thinking about private practice as a competition. Like, I've long abandoned that philosophy, in that I think that our competitors should be part of our network, and we should ideally all be working together, because there's enough need out there so that there's enough employment for everybody. And it's just finding, again, what you're interested in doing and supporting, digging that out or carving that out for yourself while you're supporting other people to pursue their passions.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's particularly challenging, I think, in the auto industry, just because of the dynamic of like dueling reports and sometimes being asked to provide a rebuttal report and so on. I recently was asked to do a rebuttal report of another OT, and I looked at the other OT's report and I was like, but we're saying the same thing. Like, I mean, I suppose that, it just doesn't make sense. So it's something that we want to be kind of like actively on guard for, I feel, in the auto industry, just in order to sort of avoid any of that negativity that sort of builds up and doesn't help anyone, right? Why start a battle? There's no benefit to it.
Exactly.
And it doesn't help the client.
I love your comment, Tricia, that your competitors are not your enemies. And it kind of segues really nicely into, honestly, a bit of the impetus for this podcast. And that is that we're really finding a shift. We're really finding that a lot of, OSAP members who are private practitioners are really looking for a lot of what you've said. They're really looking to share. They're really looking to learn. They're looking to give, build their network. And I'm seeing that shift. And so I think it's completely in line with what you've been saying to us. So just really want to thank you so much again, Tricia. It was a pleasure to get to know you, and we're excited to see what happens next in this lovely journey that you've been forging ahead for yourself.
Well, thank you very much. It has been fun to kind of reflect back. Thank you, ladies.
Awesome. Thanks, Tricia. It was so interesting to explore Tricia's full circle journey. Next week, join us for our last episode as we interview Julie Entwistle and have a conversation packed with information. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss our last episode.